Perfect. One, welcome. Thank you all for coming here this morning. Welcome to everyone on live stream, and a special shout out to one of my favorite Canadians, Jeremy's dad, Phil, who I was told is watching this morning. But we're glad you're here this morning. And as Jeremy said, Hanukkah is not one of the appointed festivals that we find in the Bible. It's a tradition that came much later, but the reason we're discussing it this morning is one word, and that word is Jesus. It was important to him. It actually played a major role in his ministry. One of his greatest statements he made, or most profound statements that he made, was actually during Hanukkah. And we'll cover that here in a little bit, but I just wanted to give you a roadmap of where we're going today with this. We'll talk about what is Hanukkah. We're not going to do that the whole time. This is not a boring history lesson for the next however many minutes. We'll give a quick overview of it. And then what does Hanukkah have to do with Jesus? In other words, should Christians care about this day? What's the significance? And then how do we as believers apply Hanukkah, or can we even apply it to not just a couple days out of the year, but to our daily lives? So that's where we're going. And spoiler alert, I'm going to conclude with we can apply it, but that application is not going to be a call or the application of, hey, we need to go and celebrate this. That's a decision you make on your own. That's not where we're going. It's going to be much deeper than that in terms of the Great Commission in our lives. So let's jump right into it. What is Hanukkah? And I think the easiest way to start out what is Hanukkah is what Hanukkah is not. And if you're like me, you grew up, you thought it was one, I didn't know what Hanukkah was. I just assumed that it was Jewish Christmas, but it is not Jewish Christmas, all right? That's not what Hanukkah is, and props to whoever made this online. I stole it offline, but that is not what Hanukkah is. Hanukkah was around before Christmas, about 170 years before Christ came to earth is when they started to celebrate it. But if you were to go to just kind of a modern day Hanukkah party or celebration, you would see a lot of this on this slide right here. There is some great Jewish a cappella boy band groups out there doing parody songs. For all of you Taylor Swift fans, they do some of those too. There's tacky sweaters, there's gifts. At the bottom right there, you can see the dreidel. That's just a game they play where you win chocolate coins to eat. Who doesn't love chocolate? And then in the middle, front and center, fried food, all about the donuts and the fried potatoes. So that's what you would see. Those are kind of the elements of a modern day Hanukkah celebration. Where the donuts? You told me you were bringing them. So, see Jeremy afterward for your free donut. But those are the elements of Hanukkah, what you would see if you were to go. But what Hanukkah really is it's an 8-day feast of dedication, or a festival of lights, as it's commonly known, celebrating the reconsecration of the temple in Jerusalem. Why did the temple need to be reconsecrated or rededicated? It was because of this guy right here, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He was the king of the Hellenistic Syrian, or the Greek kingdom, and he reigned from 175 to 164 BCE. And then this what's highlighted in green right here is really the main point we're taking away from today. He was best known for his encouragement of Greek culture and institutions. So he really sought to unify his empire through common religion, which was the Greek religion of the time, and also common culture. So this meant for the Jewish people that he was going to take away all of their identity, no worship of Yahweh, of the God of Israel. And so his attempts to suppress Judaism brought on the War of the Maccabees, which ultimately, concluded with kind of where the celebration of Hanukkah comes from. But I thought this was a really good summary statement of what he was actually trying to do. He wasn't trying to Hellenize the Jews. He was trying to totally eliminate all traces of Jewish culture. The way that he went about doing this was he took the righteous high priest in Jerusalem at the time. He replaced that high priest with that person's brother, who was open to the Hellenization Greek culture coming in. And then eventually he replaced that guy with another person that said, I'll bring in more money from the temple for your kingdom. And so you can imagine how pleased the Israelites or the Jewish people were with this. And then while Antiochus was off on one of his war campaigns, rumors spread across Jerusalem that Antiochus is dead, so we're going to take back the temple. We're going to go to war with him. And he actually wasn't dead, so you can imagine how happy he was when he found that out. So he committed a lot of atrocities. in Israel, killed a lot of people, a lot of Jewish people. But one of the things that he did leading up to this, kind of to unify the culture, unify through culture and common religion, was, and this is from the book of Maccabees, which is extra biblical literature, but it's good historical information. But Antiochus wrote to the whole kingdom that all people should be one people. And for the Jewish people in particular, this meant for them that they were no longer allowed to keep Sabbath or feast days. They were no longer allowed to circumcise their young males. There was no Torah that was allowed, no teachings of God. So really these big, identities of who they were and also of their faith, in worship to God. And this wasn't just to slap you on the wrist if you get caught doing these things. All of these things, if you were caught doing any of these things, they were all punishable by death. And there are horrific stories. I won't give examples, but there are terrible stories of people who were put to death for doing these things listed here. Furthermore, when Antiochus did hear about the uprising in Jerusalem of the Jewish people trying to take back the temple, he came into Jerusalem and he desecrated the temple. He raided the temple, and he did some pretty awful things. To start off with, he stole the treasures within the temple. After he had stolen the treasures in the temple, he set up an altar to Zeus in the temple, and he sacrificed a pig on the altar. And just for, we've talked about it before here, but the temple is that one place. It's the image of Eden. We lost Eden. We lost paradise with God. The temple was where God's presence dwelt. So it was where heaven touched earth. It was the Eden that we had here on earth. So when he comes in and desecrates the temple, it's not just, a random structure. It is the dwelling place of the God of Israel. And so he sets up an altar to Zeus inside the temple of Yahweh, inside the temple, and then sacrifices a pig. If you're familiar with Jewish culture, the pig was probably the most unclean animal. I mean, when they do archaeological digs in Israel, they determine where, if there were Israelites living in the area by whether or not there were pigs and other unclean animals, found in the remains. So they just completely stayed away from pigs at all cost. And so Antiochus knew this, so he sacrificed a pig inside that temple. And then, arguably, this is the worst of them all. The temple was filled with debauchery and reveling by the Gentiles who dallied with harlots and had intercourse with women in the sacred precincts of the temple. So this is a bad day. This is a very bad day for people who are loyal to Yahweh, whether they're Jews, Gentiles that had come into the faith, whatever it may be. The only modern equivalent I can really give you for this would be, and I hate even using this as an example, but this would be in the early 1940s, somewhat the equivalent if the Nazis were to have won World War II and Hitler were to have come across, over to America and took over the White House and set up members of the Nazi Party as president and, congressmen and women, that kind of thing, and having a Nazi celebration ceremony in the dwelling place of the president in the White House. And so that's kind of what we can think of it as, is kind of an equivalent to what this was to the Jewish people, although it's even greater to them because it's still the God that we serve. So it's one up from that. But all of this led to the Maccabean revolt. There was a priest in a town who wasn't having any of this. So long story short, he and his 5 sons decided, they were going to rebel against this. And one of his sons was named Judah Maccabee, and he became the leader of this army, the Maccabean, army essentially. And after 3 separate campaigns and numerous battles, the Maccabees eventually, by a miracle, I mean a miracle, won this war. And another analogy, this is nothing against Tennessee High. I love Tennessee High. My wife graduated from there, but this would be like Tennessee High's football team beating the Green Bay Packers. All right, that's really what this would be. Or if the Packers aren't good this year, just pick a team that's good. So that's what this would be like. And so Hanukkah commemorates the Maccabean victory over Antiochus and the rededication of the temple that followed shortly after, which we'll get into more detail here in a little bit. But one of the aspects of Hanukkah is the miracle of light. And this is more of a traditional tale of why Hanukkah is an 8-day celebration. But according to the Talmud, which is one of Judaism's sacred texts, that when the Greeks left, and the Maccabees came in, they found 1 jar of oil with the high priest, the righteous high priest with his, mark on it. 1 jar was enough to last 1 day, burning the light in the temple. And so, as tradition has it, the miracle was that this one jar lasted for 8 days. Because to make oil for the light in the temple, it was actually about a week-long process to do. So there was enough oil, this one jar lasted 8 days, as tradition states, to keep it lit until more oil could be made. So that's one of the traditions of it. That's also why you will see, if you're familiar with the menorah, you will see a different menorah at Hanukkah. This one on the left here is called a Hanukkah. You can see it has 9 candle branches on it, as opposed to the 7 on the right, which the one on the right is the one that's in the temple. That's just more of a fun fact of Hanukkah, that there's a different menorah for it called the Hanukkah. And if you want a way to remember that, if you want a way to remember that it's called a Hanukkah, I came up, maybe April, who's a marketing genius, which, by the way, April, Casey, we're praying for you guys, as Jeremy said, maybe she'd be proud of me, because marketing's not my profession, but we've got Happy Honda Days this time of year. We've got the Lexus December to remember. But what we don't have yet is Jeremy Burden's Honda Kia sales event. Going on right now. 8 nights of big savings so that you can remember how long it is. No, I'm kidding. He knew something was coming. But no, just to have fun. I mean, again, the Hanukkah is what it's called. This is a fun way to remember. Sorry if you drive a Honda or a Kia and will not be able to get this out of your mind. But something that is interesting, an actual application for the Hanukkah is the center candle that you see right there is called a shamash, which is Hebrew for servant. And so there's a teaching that goes something, the short version of it is that each one of us, and I'll say this before this, the way that you light the menorah traditionally, or the Hanukkah at Hanukkah, is you light the center candle first, and then you light every other candle with that center candle. And you light one more candle for each night. So that by the end, this would be night 8 of Hanukkah. So it's kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 8. But you use the center candle each night to light all the candles. So the application there in the teaching is that we all have the ability to be this shamash, or this servant, where we actually spread our light to other people as a servant to them. And where have we heard that before? Jesus. So, speaking of Jesus and things that he has said that are good for application, which is pretty much all he has said, what does Hanukkah have to do with Jesus at all? And so if we go back and we remember our not so good buddy Antiochus, that he wasn't just trying to Hellenize the Jews, but to totally eliminate all traces of Jewish culture, this was nearly 170 years before Jesus was on earth. And so, had he been successful in this, we have to ask the question. Now, would God allow this? No. This is why Tennessee High beat the Green Bay Packers, right, in this war. Because God's not going to allow a human king who is against him to come in and wreck his plans of worldwide salvation, right? And so, but 170 years before, if he had been successful in this, he was before Jesus in that. So Jesus is the seed. We know him as the seed of salvation. Jesus is the promised prophet from Deuteronomy 18, right? So when Moses is speaking to the people, God speaks to Moses, and it's when the Lord says, I will raise up for them a prophet like you, like Moses, from among their brothers. And I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And so we know Jesus as that promised prophet, that Messiah that came, who spoke the words that the Father gave to him. Excuse me. And to put it as Jesus did, going back to what Antiochus was trying to do, Jesus, when he's talking to a Samaritan woman and she's going back and forth, hey, are we going to worship, which mountain are we going to worship on, Gerizim or here? And Jesus responds by saying, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. And so again, God's not going to allow a human king, Antiochus, to wreck his plans of worldwide salvation that has not yet come into the world. And furthermore, on Jesus, what Hanukkah really is, I gave you the traditional, kind of the one jar lasting for 8 nights, but this is the actual historical, account of what Hanukkah is a celebration of. It's a re-celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, which Jeremy has preached on here, I think 4 years now, going on 4 years, yes. So because they could not, this war, this campaign that they had to fight against lasted for 3 years. And so when they finally recovered the temple, they actually purified the temple and the sanctuary on the same day that it had been defiled years before. So that's a cool story in and of itself. That's a great, a holy reverse that we'll call it. But they also, it says in verse 6 right here of 2 Maccabees 10, that they celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, remembering how not long before, during the Feast of Tabernacles, they had been wandering in the mountains and the caves like wild animals. So what Hanukkah really was a celebration of, or a re-celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, which, as Jeremy's taught on here numerous times before, tabernacles is where the word Jesus became flesh and dwelt or tabernacled among us. And it was actually said, this is according to the Mishnah, which Mishnah is part of that Talmud, the sacred text I mentioned earlier. It was actually said that at the Feast of Tabernacles, that the light of the menorah was so great. They had these really high menorahs set up in the temple that you can kind of see up there. They were anywhere from 50 to 70 feet high on the branches. But it was said that the lights from these menorah were so great that it lit up the entire city of Jerusalem. And here's a picture of first century Jerusalem, what it looked like. I think my pointer will work right here. Yep, so right there, that's the temple complex. This point is the temple. That's where that light would have been coming from. It would have been shining down across the entire city, giving light to all who were in the city during that time, during the Feast of Tabernacles, when the light of the world, as John puts it, came into the world. And speaking of, and you can see here, Jerusalem is still to this day, but you can see in this picture right here, it's a city on a hill. So if you can imagine a city on a hill at the Feast of Tabernacles, when the Messiah was born, being lit up and being a light to the entire city. A city on a hill cannot be hid. Where has that come in to a teaching before? I know Jesus was in Galilee when he said this, but I think it can be multi-applicable in the sense of when he's speaking to the people and he says, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden." And so I would have to think, I can't tell you for certain, I would have to think that somebody hearing this message, the next time that they go up to the Feast of Tabernacles, seeing the city lit up, remembering Jesus' "You are the light of the world" teaching, this would be in their mind. And in verse 15, Jesus says, "Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all that were in the house." Again, giving light to the entire city. So in the same way, Jesus tells us, "Let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." We'll come back to this on the application part of this teaching, but I do want to touch on this, this concept of light, because Hanukkah, again, if I didn't say it at the beginning, Hanukkah is also known as the Festival of Light. And so there's a major light theme, and then you kind of think Feast of Tabernacles, lighting up the whole city. Let's look at the symbolism of light in the Bible. And this is something that Jesse, you preached on several weeks ago, and I know Jeremy touched on these verses too, so I didn't want to be left out. I wanted to put them in the presentation as well. But 1 John 5, 2-4, verse 2 starts out, it says, "By this we know that we love God, or that we love the children of God, when we love God and obey his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments." Kind of this obedient children. Your children show you that they love you by being obedient to you. Kind of the concept that at least I think mostly every parent that I've talked to has kind of used that analogy for their children. But when we look at the symbolism of light, what does light actually mean in regards to this teaching right here? If we go back to Proverbs 6:23, we see that it says that the commandment is a lamp. And the teaching in Hebrew, Torah, best in my mind and in many scholars' mind, translated as the teachings of God, the teaching is a light. And so this one right here, this changed the way that I read the parable of the 10 virgins. Keeping, the lights, or the lamps, the lights, the oil burning, that kind of thing. But for the sake of this teaching, we're looking at the teachings of God being a light. And so when we have that in our mind, and we look at the language of John, when John said the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, or in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Just a couple verses later, John says about Jesus, he says, "In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And verse 9 says, the true light, meaning Jesus, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. So again, Jesus is the embodied teaching. I know Jeremy's preached on that before. Jesus is the embodiment of the Word of God. So him being the true light, he's the fulfillment of that symbolism of the teaching of God, right? And this is why you get later on in John, Jesus is actually at the Feast of Tabernacles. Again, that feast where the light from the temple would have lit the whole city. Jesus makes two I am statements at the Feast of Tabernacles, and they are both, I am the light of the world. So you can imagine if you're walking around and the city's lit with the temple light, at nighttime, because they don't have electricity, obviously, and it's giving off so much light that the whole city is being lit up, and Jesus is going around preaching, I am the light of the world. You can imagine what's going through the people's minds as they are sitting there listening to him. And so Jesus makes these two statements here, and then in John chapter 10, we actually get, before I get there too, one other thing that Jesus is doing, if you read John 7 through 9, and just by my count, we looked at that Deuteronomy promised prophet, being Jesus, about how that promised prophet will have the words of God, in his mouth, that God will put his words in his mouth and that the people should listen to him. I counted 7 times in John chapter 7 through 9 where Jesus goes around and essentially said, my teaching isn't mine, but it's from the one who sent me. He words it a little bit different every time, so it's kind of, you think that, you hear the light of the world, then you hear him saying these things. It is about as messianic as language gets. Jesus is making a bold statement here about who he is and his ministry. And then in chapter 10 of John, we get to the Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah. And this is where Jesus makes a very profound statement. This is what verse 22 says. It says, at that time, the Feast of Dedication, which that's Hanukkah. Hanukkah means dedication. But the Feast of Dedication took place in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple, in the colonnade of Solomon. So Jesus is at the temple for Hanukkah, walking around in Solomon's colonnade, or the colonnade of Solomon. And this is where, he's questioned by people. They say, how long are you going to keep us in suspense? Just tell us plainly if you are the Christ. And Jesus kind of, again, he goes, hey, I've told you, but you don't believe. This is my sheep hear my voice, and they know my voice, they know who I am. And my Father will not allow them to be snatched from me. And then this is the big statement right here in John 10:30. Jesus says here, at the Feast of Dedication, at Hanukkah, after this buildup of I'm the light of the world, I'm the light of the world, he says, I and the Father are one. He is equating himself with Yahweh, with God. And you kind of wonder, going back to verse 22, hey, John, parchment and writing back then is really expensive. Why are you telling us it was winter? Jesus is walking in the temple, and why are you giving us his specific location in the colonnade of Solomon? Well, there's a great purpose for that. Here's a picture of the temple outlined. Here is where Jesus was. Solomon's portico is sometimes how it's translated, but that's where Jesus is giving this message. And what's very unique about this area of the temple is that this is an area of the temple where anybody, regardless whether you're Jew, Gentile, disability, etc., does not matter. It is a place where everyone can gather. And that is where he's making his statement that I and the Father are one. He's showing here, if he was inside this square area right here, which is the temple proper, only Israelites can enter there. Actually, women can enter right here, and past this little gate right there, if you can see that, only men can go in. Jesus isn't going just for a specific group of people. He's making this I and the Father are one statement where the entire world, or anybody who is there present, regardless of their ethnic background or the physical nature of their body, can hear his message and what he is proclaiming. And just as to give it a little bit more, this is actually one of 2 replicas that they found, basically saying if you were to enter inside this area right here and you are a foreigner, that you are responsible for your own death. So it was not it wasn't a slap on the wrist if you enter there. It was, hey, if we find you in there, we're going to kill you if you're a foreigner. And that's why Jesus came down to break down that dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile that we read about, right, in Ephesians chapter 2. But we've gone over a little bit of this, where Jesus is, why it was important to him. What I want to do now is talk about how can Christians apply Hanukkah, or even can we apply Hanukkah? What's the application there? And what I want to do, yes, I heard that, Rachel. I heard that, Rachel. Rachel said this little boy's cute up here, isn't he, though? Little Harvard shirt asking a question. But yeah, so how can we apply it, or can we at all? We talked a little bit about how Jesus is that seed of salvation, how that was words that he stated, that salvation is from the Jews. We know that was from him. And that's not that, that's just God's chosen instrument, right? It had to come from somewhere. That's where God chooses. Now, Paul elaborates on this a little bit in terms of where salvation comes from. He does it a lot, but specifically here in Galatians chapter 3, Paul says, "Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his seed." It does not say to seeds, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your seed, who is Christ, right? And this is kind of, he's saying that Jesus is that seed from Abraham that will be, salvation for the world. This goes all the way back. If you were here for the rereading Genesis, this is a repeat slide, but this goes all the way back, this seed language of why it's important. Because remember, whether you interpret it as the snake in the garden or the divine being in the garden, either way, the Lord said, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed." So you think about what Antiochus was trying to do by erasing all of Jewish culture, basically. That's kind of butting heads against this too, or against this idea between the two seeds. And so, but you have the seed language is really important, because salvation is that's what Jesus and that's what Paul they're elaborating on. They know that salvation is coming ultimately from Jesus, but this is the enmity between the two seeds right here. And this is also the author, particularly right here of Genesis, telling you that genealogies are important in the Bible, because this is where salvation is going to come from, right? This is where the redemption is going to come from. And this is why, amongst many places in the Bible, but Matthew specifically starts out his gospel with the genealogy of Jesus Christ, tracing him back to Abraham, through David. David was the one that the promised Messiah would come through. But it gets better than this, because guess who else is the seed? If we read just a little bit, just about 12 verses, later in Galatians chapter 3, Paul says this: "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." And the next verse is this: "And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise." So when you accept Jesus, you are not, you're not some foreigner that just comes in and, I'm kind of on the outskirts of the family. No, you are now Abraham's seed. You get to partake fully in that promise too. Paul says it this way in Romans 11:17, really kind of the whole chapter 11, but it's where he's using the analogy of wild olive branches and natural olive branches, and how the essentially foreigners or Gentiles that come into the faith, come believing in Jesus, that they are wild olive shoots. They get grafted into the olive tree. And if we go back, again, symbolism of the Bible, we looked at light earlier. The symbol of the olive tree is Israel. Israel is an olive tree, right? That's what it is. So what Paul is saying is that you get grafted into Israel. And I know that's confusing, because Israel's is a country now. That's not what I'm talking about. Think of it more of a last name, like a Smith or a Barker or a Burden or whoever. That's kind of, just think of Israel as that you are just part of God's family. Now you get grafted into the family. I know I've used the analogy before. If Caitlin and I were to adopt children, we would have our biological children and our adopted children, but collectively they would be our family. We wouldn't distinguish a difference between them, right? We would treat them the same. We'd say, you are now a Smith. You're now a member of the family. And that's exactly the point that Paul is making here. And Paul does say in other places, such as Romans, he says there is an advantage to being a natural, olive branch, essentially. What's the advantage? He words it this way. He says in Romans 3, verse 1, "Then what advantage has the Jew? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God," right? And if we go back to Acts 37, we see that these oracles are actually what was given to the Israelites in the wilderness at Mount Sinai, which was the Torah, or the teachings that we looked at earlier, essentially, the ways on how to live a godly lifestyle, if you want to think about it that way. And it says, verse 37 right there, "God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brothers." and kind of referencing back to that messianic language, and then talking about the living oracles. So there is an advantage there, right? The oracles are the teachings, just like the light from Proverbs. So they kind of all intermingle together. So there is an advantage. And because I picked on Jeremy earlier, I'm going to redeem you right here. Here's your callback. I know how much you love the Patriot. So I cropped you over Mel Gibson's face as he's making that final charge, right? So I'll send it to you. You may get your new profile picture. But I did get Jeremy's permission to use him as an example, just didn't send him the pictures beforehand. But in all seriousness, I do want to use Jeremy as an analogy because Jeremy is, sorry, there's another one. Jeremy, he's Canadian by birth, American by the grace of God, right? And so, I'm so sorry, I had to. But so Jeremy became a citizen, right? Jeremy went through the naturalization process of becoming a citizen. He was not a natural-born citizen like most or all of us here, to where we were just born into this country, right? Jeremy had to go through a pretty grueling process of getting his citizenship, and we're very thankful that you did. To put Paul's words on Jeremy's situation, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail on it. This is, what advantage has the American? Much in every way, for to them the Constitution was written, right? We kind of grew up with it. We know Jeremy had to come in, he had to learn it, and again, thank the Lord that you did. But yeah, it's a good analogy to use. But however, while this is the greatest country on earth, there's no question about that, America. The greatest kingdom on earth is the kingdom of God, right? And so when Jeremy became a citizen, that's all he became. It was just a citizen, like any one of us. We're just citizens. But when you enter the kingdom of God, not through a naturalization process of traveling, all over the country and doing a lot of paperwork and taking tests, when you accept the free gift of salvation through Jesus that is just presented before you, you don't just become a citizen. You become a royal priest. As 1 Peter 2:9 puts it, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession. But it gets better. You're not just a royal priest. You are also a child of God. And because you are a child of God, you are an heir of God and a co-heir or a fellow heir with Jesus. So you're not just a citizen. You're a royal priest and a co-heir with the one that will reign. Right? And so because of this, and this is where I'm looping back in and giving you the full picture of Jeremy with Uncle Sam, the analogy I'm using here is this. Jeremy became a citizen, right? He became a citizen just a couple of years ago. But Jeremy partakes in the full history of this country, just like all of us do. None of us can go back to 1776 and even prior when people first started coming over. But we do. We embrace the full history of our country, much in the same way that Jeremy does. I mean, you're not going to find someone here more patriotic, I would argue, than Jeremy. I mean, look at the shirt. Look at the shirt. And he's got the American flag boots right there. But very much in the same way, now that we have been not just brought in as citizens, but as royal priests and also as co-heirs, that we can embrace the history. We're Abraham's seed, going back to that. We can embrace the full history of the people that God chose to bring about this promise, right? And again, the application of this teaching on Hanukkah is not that, hey, now we need to all celebrate Hanukkah. That's not what I'm saying. It goes deeper than that. But we can honor that tradition. Listen, I will say Happy Hanukkah every single day of the year because of Hanukkah, because of the Maccabean revolt, salvation came through Jesus later. I will Happy Hanukkah that again every day of the year for that. But even more so than being a royal priesthood and co-heirs, we are temples, right? We are temples of God. We're these little mini temples that walk around on the earth, if you will. Paul in 1 Corinthians says this, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" Again, I know I touched on it earlier, but I use this slide every time, so I had to. If you haven't seen it before, this is a slide of heaven meeting earth. This right here is heaven. This down here is earth. This middle part right here, that's Eden. That's paradise. The temple was symbolic of Eden because it's where God's presence dwelt on earth. Eden was where humanity and God dwelt together on earth. And so us being these temples that come around, that's God's Spirit dwelling in us. We're not just, don't think of yourself just as a temple, Think of yourself as a mini Eden that gets to walk around on this earth and spread the Garden of Eden or the kingdom of God throughout the entire earth. And so just a little bit more in terms of Jesus, right? Jesus, we know Jesus is the servant. There's 4 servant passages in the book of Isaiah, right? Most popular being Isaiah 53. But one of those is Isaiah 49, verse 6. And it's talking about the servant that would come. This is a picture of Christ who will come, of Jesus who will come. And it says, "You should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." I read commentary on this from a scholar, and he said this is basically the Great Commission of the Old Testament right here. And future speaking of the future Messiah. And so just as this servant, who we know as Jesus, came into the world, and John hit on this too, as the true light, going back to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus passes this on to those that will follow him by saying, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hid." Right? Let your light shine before others. Right? Just as the temple was shining at the Feast of Tabernacles with the light of the menorah, so let your light shine before others. And Todd and Pastor Todd and the worship team, you all can start making your way back up here because we are wrapping this up. But I want to leave it with this, just a couple more points. Just as Joshua, when he was speaking to the Israelites, he told them, "Choose this day whom you will serve," right? Whether it's the gods of your fathers that you once served, pick your side. Who are you going to serve? In the same way, Paul tells us to go to 1 Corinthians 3:17. We looked at 3:16 earlier, that if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. This is why, I got these 2 pictures up here to really illustrate the point. You and I as the temple. Hanukkah was the reconsecration of the temple, the rededication of the temple. So my challenge to you and the call to action, if you will, the application is this. What is your temple going to look like? Who are you going to be serving? Listen, my temple's not perfect at all. I defile it daily. We all defile it, our bodies by sin that we commit each and every day. But this is why we are called to pick up our cross daily, to crucify those things, to put them to death, and to present our bodies as a living sacrifice to God, holy and acceptable, which is our spiritual act of worship. And so, my prayer for us today is that, to finish off this verse from Joshua 24, is that you and I, as the many temples on earth, that we individually and collectively will come together and declare, "But as for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh." So, let your light shine before men. Light up the temple just as it was lit. Light up your temple. Let that light shine, the true light of Jesus shine for all of the world to see. And remember that during this season, this is a time to rededicate and reconsecrate our temple. So, happy Hanukkah. Thank you all.
Pray into as we're coming up for this. Brad, again, thank you so much. So well prepared. There's a verse I want to say this as we come to pray right now. John 17, Jesus says, as he's talking with the Father in the garden, "And the glory which you have given to me, I have given to them." So as we're thinking about Hanukkah, what it means, like I said, the history was great. It's fun to know that. But the deepest part of us right now is we are... And I'm going to say this, Brad's going to do another teaching on this in the future, but there's a reason why God says, do not carve any idol or anything into my image. God says, make no image of me. Do you know why he says that? Because it's already been done. He did it. What does it say? Let us, when God in Genesis, what does he say? Let us make man in what? Our own image. And so I've asked Brad later, I don't know when it is, but he's going to do a teaching between understanding that we're also a temple, but an image of God. So the question is to you, if you can be like, well, my life is great. How do I rededicate my temple? Or what spots What are parts in my life that I need to clean out this season right here as we're thinking about what's going on? Well, look in the mirror, and the best way to answer that question is, what part of you doesn't line up of the character of Christ? And that's a hard line because there's so much there. But what part of you doesn't line up with the character of Christ? And if we are called to be the image of God, what part of us is not lined up with the image of God? What part of us is not shining that light? And so I want to pray as we're coming into this season, because this was as important to Jesus as it is to us right now. The temple is a holy space, and now God knows that we're not talking about this building, even though we do want to take care of it. We want to be stewards of a place where we get to gather. We need to be a better steward of this temple right here, a better steward of this. So what part of this is not shining the light of Jesus? And that's the part where we come to the altar and say, Father, that part of my life that is masking your glory, please forgive me, and I'm going to take the steps I need to take care of it. So Brad, thank you. So Father, we come to this time